At 52, David Holloway woke one quiet March morning with no desire to get out of bed. Not from exhaustion, not from illness, just no reason. There was a time when he rose at 5 a.m. like clockwork, hands steady on the coffee pot, eyes skimming headlines while emails stacked like soldiers. David had built a name as a top-tier strategy consultant in New York. Every move was calculated, every word aligned with an outcome. His life was one long sprint toward recognition. Now the schedule was empty. No clients, no goals, and oddly, no sadness, just stillness. He called it the strange silence, like a spotlight that once lit up the whole room, now shining on nothing at all. As if he'd stepped off stage mid-scene, forgetting his lines, the audience, even why he was performing in the first place. He didn't tell anyone. He knew what they'd say. Take a vacation, try a hobby, maybe see a doctor. But deep down, something quieter whispered, this isn't depression. This is something else, something unnamed. There had been a moment a few months back meditating in Nepal when everything shifted. A stillness fell over him. Not peace exactly, but a disarming clarity. He saw through the chase, the proving, the persona he'd spent decades perfecting. At first, it felt like freedom. But now, it felt like standing in an empty house that once was home. No fire, no fight, no forward motion. Not emptiness in the tragic sense, but a hollow pause, weightless and unfamiliar. A space between what was and whatever might come next. And in that silence, David waited. Not for answers, but for a new kind of question to arrive. Before the stillness, there was fire. David had once burned with ambition so fierce it lit up every room he entered. In boardrooms, his voice carried weight. In strategy sessions, his mind sliced through complexity like a blade. He didn't just work. He thrived on momentum, deadlines, and delivering results that left others in awe. Recognition wasn't the goal, but it certainly helped. Applause, bonuses, plaques on the office wall, they were signs he was moving in the right direction. He had been the man people looked to when things got messy, calm, precise, always in control. That's why the collapse felt so foreign. There had been no crisis, no scandal, no dramatic failure, just a subtle unraveling. It began with a question, barely a whisper. What's the point? At first, he ignored it, pushed harder, took on new projects, enrolled in a meditation course in the Himalayas, thinking he'd return sharper, renewed. But something else happened up there. Amid the foggy peaks and quiet monasteries, something inside him let go. He couldn't name it, but he felt it, like a cord snapping inside his chest. His thoughts slowed. The need to be someone started to dissolve. The mountains didn't care about resumes. The monks didn't ask what he did for a living. And for the first time, he didn't feel like explaining. When he came back to the States, nothing had changed, but everything had. Emails felt empty. Small talk exhausted him. Even the news cycle that once gave him fuel now felt like noise. He tried to pretend, signed up for events, reconnected with old clients, but it all rang hollow. He wasn't tired. He wasn't sad. He was finished. Not in a dramatic way, just complete, like a book he'd already read. But if that chapter was over, he now stood at the start of a blank page. And blank pages are terrifying. David stopped pretending. He canceled the networking events, let unanswered emails pile up, and quietly withdrew from everything that once structured his life. His calendar, once color-coded with purpose, now looked like a blank slate. Mornings bled into afternoons, afternoons into dusk, and still he felt no urgency. He wasn't numb, but neither was he engaged. Life moved around him like a movie he no longer had a role in. He'd wake early, make tea, and sit on the porch, not to think, but simply because there was nothing else calling him. The birds sang, the wind rustled. It all went on untouched by his absence. His daughter, Anna, visited more often now. She'd bring groceries, check in. "You okay, Dad?" she'd ask gently. He'd smile. "I'm fine," he'd lie. But inside, a question lingered. Was he still himself if the fire was gone? What scared him wasn't despair. It was the absence of desire. No passion, no hunger, not even curiosity. He used to cry when he felt unproductive. Now he didn't care if he did anything at all. Some might call it depression, but it didn't feel like that. It wasn't heavy, it was hollow. And yet, there was something sacred about the silence. Like life had muted itself so something deeper could be heard. A pause between songs, a breath between lifetimes. One morning, David found himself staring at a tree outside his window. He couldn't stop watching. The branches, bare from winter, stood like bones against the sky. He watched for nearly an hour, saying nothing, thinking nothing, just being. And in that moment, he realized something unsettling. He hadn't felt that present in years. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a breakdown. Maybe it was a slow, unspoken becoming. A transformation, not of fire, but of stillness. It had been 10 years since David last saw Elliot Wu. They'd met in a leadership seminar in Boston, both ambitious, sharp, driven. Back then, Elliot was a rising academic star with dual PhDs and a seat on prestigious think tanks. He was the kind of man who devoured books like oxygen and spoke in layers of thought. Then one day, he vanished. No farewell, no meltdown, just gone. Rumors said he'd moved to a cabin near Ashland, Oregon, left academia entirely, and started teaching meditation to veterans. David never reached out. Until now. Something about the quiet unraveling inside him made Elliot feel relevant again. So he drove up the winding pine-lined roads and found a small cedar cabin tucked into the hillside. Elliot answered the door barefoot, wrapped in a loose sweater with a face both older and softer than David remembered. They sat in silence for a while. No rush, no need to fill the space. Finally, David spoke. "I think I've lost myself." Elliot smiled gently, pouring tea. "No, you haven't lost yourself. You're just losing the version of you that was never real." The words hit like a soft thunder. Elliot leaned back, eyes kind. "You're not broken, David. You're just between identities. The fire that drove you was ego, and now it's gone. What's left feels like nothing. But that nothing is sacred." David stared at his tea, unsure whether to cry or breathe easier. In the quiet, Elliot added, "This isn't an end. It's a pause. And in that pause, something ancient is waking up." That evening, Elliot pulled an old weathered book from a shelf, a worn copy of Modern Man in Search of a Soul by Carl Jung. He placed it between them, as if inviting not just a conversation, but a third presence into the room. "You ever read Jung?" Elliot asked. David nodded vaguely. "Only quoted in TED Talks." Elliot chuckled. "Then you've met his echo, not his voice." He flipped to a page, ran a finger beneath a sentence, and read aloud. "Enlightenment does not come from imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." David leaned in. "Jung understood," Elliot said, that true awakening isn't blissful, it's dismantling. The ego, the persona we wear to survive in society, gets burned off. What's left behind isn't the self yet. It's the void between. He tapped the page. Jung called it the nigredo, the blackening. A stage in alchemy when the old form dies and the new one hasn't emerged. It feels like death because psychologically it is. David sat still, words settling into the hollow parts of him. So, this emptiness, he said slowly, isn't failure? Elliot shook his head. It's individuation, the process of becoming whole. But first, everything false must go. Motivation based on status, approval, achievement. It can't follow you where you're going. David let out a slow breath. Something inside loosened. Jung had written what David had been feeling but couldn't name. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't apathetic. He was standing at the edge of a life built by ego, watching it dissolve. Most people fight it, Elliot continued. They panic. Fill the void with noise, work, pleasure, distractions. But if you can stay in it, really stay, the self begins to rise. David looked out the window. The sky was darkening, the forest wrapped in silence. So I just wait? No, Elliot said gently. You listen? To what? Elliot smiled. To the part of you that doesn't speak in words. David sat with that, and for the first time in months, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt sacred. The next morning, David woke with a strange surge of energy. Maybe it was the talk, maybe it was the tea, maybe he just needed structure again. So he made a list. He signed up for an online leadership workshop, rejoined his old alumni group, even booked a weekend networking retreat in San Francisco. For a few hours, it felt good, familiar, productive. But as the day wore on, something didn't sit right. He opened the leadership course and stared at the screen. Buzzwords blinked back. Optimize performance. Unlock your potential. Crush your goals. His stomach turned. He clicked into the alumni group forum, comment threads about promotions, IPOS, keynote invites. He didn't feel inspired. He felt invisible. By nightfall, the retreat confirmation sat unread in his inbox. That old world, the one built on proving, performing, producing, no longer fit. It was like slipping into a suit that once made him feel powerful, only now it itched. He wanted it to work. He really did. But deep down, he knew that fire was gone. The kind of drive that once lit his chest, urgent, focused, relentless, had been replaced by something else. Not a spark, not a blaze, a hum, quiet, subtle, present. That night, he stepped outside, barefoot on cold grass, looked up at the stars, and for a moment, he didn't want to optimize anything. He just wanted to breathe. David didn't cancel the retreat. He just never showed up. Instead, he stayed home and cleaned the garage, not out of obligation, but because the sunlight hit the dust in a way that made him pause. He found an old box of sketchbooks he barely remembered. Inside were charcoal smudges of forgotten afternoons back when he used to draw without purpose. He sat down, opened a blank page, picked up a pencil, and for no reason at all began to draw. It wasn't art, it wasn't good, but it was honest. The next day he took a slow walk through the woods, no headphones, no goal, just the sound of leaves crunching and his breath keeping time. There was no checklist, no calendar ping, only presence. He started keeping a journal, not a planner, just a collection of thoughts, images, pieces of silence. Some pages were blank. Some held a single word, others unraveled into paragraphs he didn't know he had inside him. He wasn't getting better. He wasn't coming back. He was becoming quiet enough to notice something soft stirring. It didn't roar like ambition. It hummed like truth. He told Elliot one afternoon, "It's strange. I don't know what I'm becoming, but I don't think I want the old version of me back." Elliot nodded. "That's because you're not healing to return. You're dissolving to begin." David looked out at the trees again, same ones he'd ignored for years. Now they felt like witnesses. David woke before sunrise. There was no alarm, no meeting, no plan, just an urge. He wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, stepped outside, and walked barefoot into the morning chill. The grass was damp, the air quiet, still holding its breath before the day began. He stood there, watching the horizon slowly soften from indigo to gold. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he began to cry. Not from sadness, but from something older, something like recognition. It wasn't a grand epiphany. There was no voice from the sky, no sudden clarity, only stillness. But this stillness wasn't empty anymore. It was full of space, of breath, of some gentle presence he couldn't name. He wasn't driven to write a book or launch a new venture. He didn't feel called in the way gurus described, but something had shifted. Later that morning, he made breakfast, simple eggs, toast, tea. He lit a candle, not out of ritual, but respect. And he ate in silence, savoring the way butter melts into warmth. It was nothing spectacular, but it felt alive. He wrote one line in his journal that day: "This isn't a comeback. It's a beginning I don't need to understand." When he showed Elliot the page, Elliot smiled. "You've stopped searching for fire, David. You're learning to live from the ember." David didn't reply. He just nodded, hand resting on the mug, heart unexpectedly steady. David no longer filled his days with tasks. There was no to-do list taped to the fridge, no calendar filled with reminders, no plan to become someone again. Instead, he moved slowly. He answered emails when he felt moved to, not out of guilt, but presence. He said no more often, not as rejection, but as alignment. There was a peace in that. His mornings began with quiet, sometimes journaling, sometimes sitting by the window doing absolutely nothing. He no longer needed the world to respond to him. He was learning to respond to life. The change wasn't dramatic. He didn't move to a new city or shave his head. He still paid bills, did laundry, fed the cat. But something fundamental had shifted. He wasn't performing anymore. He was participating. He no longer chased clarity like a prize. Instead, he recognized it when it arrived, usually dressed in simplicity. A conversation that lingered. A walk that reset something. A moment of laughter that opened a window inside him. He told Elliot one day, "I don't feel driven anymore. I feel drawn." Elliot replied, "That's the difference between ego and soul. One pushes, the other pulls." David smiled. He still had doubts, still felt lost sometimes, but the ache of needing to prove had faded. In its place was a quiet conviction. This is enough. Not perfect, not impressive, just true. And true, he was learning, was more than enough. David didn't become a guru. He didn't write a book or start a podcast or build a retreat center in the woods. He simply lived. Not as the man he used to be, not as the man others expected, but as someone quietly rooted in himself. He still felt unsure sometimes. Life didn't suddenly reveal a grand destiny, but he no longer needed one. The anxiety of not becoming had been replaced by the quiet joy of simply being. And being, he realized, was its own form of arrival. He looked around his home one evening. A modest cabin warmed by candlelight, books scattered, tea steaming, soft music playing low. This wasn't the life he once chased. It was better. It was true. He opened his journal and wrote one final sentence. I didn't lose myself. I lost the illusion of who I was supposed to be. And that loss, it was freedom. In the silence where fire once roared, a steady flame now lived, calm, unwavering. He no longer needed applause, no longer feared stillness. The journey had not led him out into the world, but inward, into a place that had always been waiting. A home, not made of walls or roles or titles, but of presence, of breath, of truth. And when he finally turned out the lights that night, it wasn't to escape the day. It was to rest in himself, fully, deeply, without resistance.